So we are sharing about leading from behind the scenes. It is basically, we're going to basically do a character exposition of Mordecai in the book of Esther. And so we shall be reflecting on 6 lessons from Mordecai in the next few minutes. The first lesson that we shall be looking at is the aspect of royal mentorship. Then secondly, we shall look at royal kindness. Thirdly, we shall consider royal defiance. Number 4 is royal persuasion. Number 5 is royal authority. Number 6 is royal chronicles. It is true that many of us may not be in prominent positions of leadership. However, a number of us believe that only those in prominent leadership position can make any meaningful or significant impact in society, which is not true. I would want to submit to us this morning that no matter the position we occupy in society, whether you are a domestic servant, a security guard, a cleaner, a receptionist, a waiter, a conductor in a bus, a driver, an air hostess, a farmer, a carpenter, or whatever it is that you occupy, a child, a young person, or an adult, each one of us can make a difference. Joseph made a difference in Potiphar's house as a domestic servant. The same case applies to the slave girl in Naaman's house, as we read in the book of Kings. Also, Joseph, Mary's husband, made a difference as a carpenter, as an ordinary carpenter in his time. We are also told of the Good Samaritan in Jesus' story, whom we are even not told his name, but he made a difference in somebody's life through an act of kindness. And the story continues to be told over and over again. We have heard about Rahab, who was previously a prostitute, but she made a difference because she heard about the fame of God and she welcomed the Israelite spies in her house. So you don't have to wait and for 2027 to become the president of the Republic of Kenya in order to make a difference in the nation. Neither do you have to wait until you become the general manager, managing director, or CEO of your company to make a difference. By God's grace, if you do occupy a position of leadership in society, then more is expected of you. By God's grace, I have also had the privilege of leading or making influence both from a leadership position and from behind the scenes. Somehow, right from class 4, as a tiny boy, I was chosen as a class prefect. And that continued all through to high school. The high school one happened in a very interesting way. When I joined Form 1 in the second term. So when we did the first term exams, our class teacher happened to be the one who was teaching us a subject called social education and ethics. Now, I somehow found that subject to be very easy. We had very few notes. And somehow God has given me a gift of memorizing. So I memorized all the notes. So when the exam came, I cleared everything. And so when we opened for second term, the teacher came looking for this boy who has produced a marking scheme for the subject. That is how I became a class prefect. And it went on until Form 4. But I also had the privilege of leading the Christian Union as the chairperson, which also happened in campus at Egerton University. But after campus, I've also had the privilege of making impact from behind the scenes. When I served as a focus staff for 6 years. And in Focus, we allow the students to run the show while we mentor them and train them from the background. So today we shall examine a character in the Bible who is rarely spoken about because he's not necessarily considered as the main character in the book of Esther. He was living in exile, but he made a great impact in the Babylonian Empire. And the Israelites, and in the lives of the Israelites who lived as exiles at that time, before even he occupied a prominent position. And so we are introduced to Mordecai in Esther chapter 2, verse 5 to 6. Of course, I believe many of us are familiar with the story of Esther and the literary context, or just before this particular passage, where Queen Vashti had disobeyed the king when the king wanted her to come, and so that wearing the royal crown, so that people may see how beautiful the queen was, and she declined, and as a result she was fired from being a queen, and another as such was launched for the next queen. And that is how Esther and Mordecai are introduced in this book. So Esther chapter 2 verse 5 to 6 is an introduction of Mordecai. We are told that now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. Now, I try to check some commentaries to just understand that particular background, or to just get a few details about Mordecai. And the IVP Bible background commentary says that actually chapter 2 was taking place in around 479 or 478 BC. And the exile of Jehoiakim under Nebuchadnezzar had taken place about 597 BC. That was 120 years earlier. So when we read in verse 6 about who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, it may not be referring directly to Mordecai, but rather most likely to his ancestor Kish, who is traced into the lineage of Benjamin. But besides that, we are also told that when you read the book of Esther, Mordecai features very prominently, even though he is not necessarily the main character. Actually, the Bible exposition commentary highlights that he has been mentioned about 58 times in that book, and 7 times he's identified as a Jew. And it actually identifies that his ancestor Kish was the one who had been taken captive. So it is possible that Mordecai was actually born in Babylon at that particular time. And at some point, he had the privilege of sitting at the king's gate, which is the context that we find him in as we begin reading chapter 2. So let us get straight into our reflections for today from the life of Mordecai, beginning with royal mentorship. This we find in chapter 2, verse 7 to 16 and verse 20 of chapter 2. I may not be able to read the entire passage of that, but you can read at your own time. But I'll mention a few aspects which relate to this particular lesson of royal mentorship. And in this case, we are considering how Mordecai was intentional about raising and mentoring Esther, was also called Hadassah. Hadassah is the Jewish name. Esther was the Persian name. So Esther happened to be a cousin to Mordecai, and her parents had died. And so Mordecai took up the responsibility not only of just raising Esther, but mentoring her, because he identified some potential in her. And so we are told that, for example, in verse 10, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background, because Mordecai had forbidden her from doing so. That already shows some aspect of mentorship, especially when the announcement had been made about the recruitment of the next queen, and Mordecai had seen potential in Esther in that regard. And even when Esther had been recruited, Mordecai ensured that he was present, and he followed up to find out how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. That is a mentor. The Bible says also in verse 15 that when the time came for Esther, the girl that Mordecai had adopted as her own daughter, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. I also see this as a possible impact of the mentorship that Mordecai had done. And finally, in verse 20 of chapter 2, we are told that Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do so. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. And so, we are, as I mentioned, Mordecai was intentional about mentoring Esther, as we see in this particular aspect. And one of the things that I deduce from this passage is the fact that Mordecai must have also emphasized to Esther about the importance of embracing and pursuing sexual purity. Otherwise, she wouldn't have qualified for the royal contest at that time for the coveted seat of the next queen of the Babylonian Empire. Because one of the qualifications for the recruits was that one needed to be a virgin. Beauty alone was not sufficient. One needed to be a virgin. So sexual purity was something that was important. And it is possible that Mordecai had raised and mentored Esther to appreciate the value and embrace the importance of upholding sexual purity. It is important to mention at this point that sexual purity is important even in our generation, because we are living at a time when people have normalized fornication. They have normalized cohabiting. They have normalized masturbation and pornography and other forms of sexual immorality. Our young people are competing to engage in sex and to attend sex parties with reckless abandon. I remember when I was in third year in campus, that time when I was serving as the CU chairman, we had a CU office in one of the hostels, and it was one of the rooms in the hostels. And it happened that just the next room to the CU office, which served as a library, and people would walk in and out on a daily basis, and we would have our meetings there. The next room, of course, this was a male hostel, and all the rooms had 3 occupants in that particular area. But this particular room had 6 occupants, and the beds were 3. What does that mean? These 3 gentlemen who are living in that room invited their 3 girlfriends to live with them in that particular room. So throughout the semester, these 6 young people were living as married couples when the semester is on. And when they go for holidays, everybody goes to their own home. That is part of the unfortunate reality that we are living in our time. We are living in our time, or we are witnessing in our time. And sometimes when you try to have a candid discussion with the young people, they bring up the economics question. And they say, the cost of living has skyrocketed, and we are trying to manage, trying to bring our little resources together. Allow me to say that cohabiting is not a question of economics. It is a question of morality. It sounds odd for our young people to mention to their peers that they are virgins. When somebody mentions that, they are ridiculed and laughed at. Let me encourage the few who are walking that narrow path. Please hold on and be proud of your walk of sexual purity. God is very proud of you, and we are also very proud of you. Don't compromise to fit in with the crowd. Stand out from the crowd and swim against the current. Don't be deceived that everybody is doing it, because you are not everybody. You are a child of God. We need to reject that lie without apology. And if as a young person, you are in a relationship and your fiancé, your boyfriend or your girlfriend is demanding that you enjoy the benefits of marriage before the pastor gives you the powers on the wedding day, please, I give you the permission to dissolve the relationship, run for your life, and trust God for a more serious character. But the other thing that Mordecai did in mentoring Esther was to forbid her from revealing her nationality and family background, as we see in verse 10 and 20, because that could have jeopardized her chances of being considered for the position of the queen. It is possible that if she would have disclosed her nationality in advance, some people with vested interests may have disqualified her on the basis that she was a descendant of the exiles from Israel and she was not a native Babylonian. So they would have argued that she's not very suited to become queen of that vast empire. But Esther heeded Mordecai's advice. We are living in a digital age of information explosion, where many of our young people feel that they have everything at their fingertips. They view the older people as old-fashioned and as having nothing to offer them in their time. I want to correct this notion and say that even though the younger generation knows more than the older generation, especially as far as technology is concerned, but this does not invalidate the wisdom of the older generation, which has been gathered through years of experience. Let me also say that we can also learn from the advice and mentorship that Mordecai gave to Esther about not revealing or disclosing some crucial information about herself before the time is ripe. Because in this age of social media and content creation, it seems that we no longer keep anything private. We are living at a time when somebody can live stream their life right from the time they wake up, and they are showing us their bedroom as they are waking up, and the content is streaming live on social media, what they are having for breakfast and what they are doing for the rest of the day until evening when they are going to bed. Even some live stream themselves while they are sleeping. Don't we have privacy anymore? But the other thing that I see that which Esther did, which I could attribute to Mordecai's mentorship, is that when her turn came for her to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, suggested. This means that Mordecai had mentored her and had advised her to submit to the authority at the harem and to do whatever she is told as long as it was godly. And this worked for her. The question that we may need to reflect on is, how submitted are we to those in positions of authority around us? How submitted are we? How humble are we to submit ourselves to those in positions of authority around us? So when the other people were just seeing an ordinary young exiled girl in Esther, Mordecai was seeing a queen in the making, and he did his best to give her some royal mentorship. And as a mentor, he was present and intentionally followed up to know how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. Allow me to say at this point that the younger generation is in need of mentorship. We need to be available and willing to do what it takes to raise a few more Esthers and Mordecais of our generation, who will stand out tall and unashamed among their peers, holding on to unshakable convictions about their identity and purpose in life. Unfortunately, we are living at a time when some of the older people are taking advantage of the young and orphaned and vulnerable young people, dispossessing them of their inheritance, abusing them, and leaving them hopeless and disillusioned about the future. The second reflection is about royal kindness. In chapter 2, verse 21 to 23, in chapter 6, verse 1 to 11. We are told of an incident that at one point, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. And all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. King Xerxes was not necessarily a relative to Mordecai, even though they became in-laws after he married Queen Esther. But Mordecai was kind to King Xerxes by revealing an assassination plot against him, which was successfully thwarted. He did not ignore it or allow it to happen, with the hope that possibly if King Xerxes gets out of the way, this may pave the way for Esther taking full control of the vast Babylonian empire. He was not selfish. He did not ask to be paid for his kindness. He just helped and went his way and forgot about it. But God did not forget about it. He ensured that it was recorded in the annals in the presence of the king for use at a proper time in future. This reminds me of what the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 6 verse 10, that God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. And so at the proper time, Mordecai was handsomely rewarded, as we see in Esther chapter 6 verse 1 to 11. Now this was a dramatic occurrence. The reward comes at a pivotal time when Mordecai needed it most. Because as a result of his convictions, which will be our third point about royal defiance, Mordecai found himself in crosshairs with one man, Haman, who was very senior in the empire that particular time. Bible says that Haman had been exalted to a very senior position in Babylon, and whenever he passed, especially at the king's gate, all the senior officials and everybody would bow down to him. But there was one guy called Mordecai, said, not me. And as everybody was bowing down and saying, long live Haman, long live Haman, Mordecai is just standing straight and staring at him. And even his colleagues tried to plead with him, Mordecai, you are risking your neck, my friend. Mordecai said, no, it is okay. Let me take the risk. And this thing disturbed this guy called Haman. The point that one time he arrived home very disturbed, and even though he had been invited for a dinner together with the king, a special privilege, but he said, all this does not give me happiness as long as this guy called, I'm restraining myself from using some of the words he may have used. This guy, Who does he think he is? As long as he sits at the gate and refuses to bow down to me. His wife and friends suggested a thing, an idea. Why should you just... The king has given you the entire empire. Why should you just be disturbed by a single individual? What does it cost us to eliminate him or to neutralize the threat? Why don't you instruct your servants to construct a gallows? Even they gave the measurements. Then in the morning, go to the king and ask him for permission to have this guy hanged. Then in the evening, go for dinner. But that very night, Bible says in Psalms that he who watches over Israel neither sleeps nor slumbers. And on that particular night, preceding the morning that Mordecai was to be hanged, the Lord of heaven, the King of heaven, caused the King Xerxes to lack sleep. That time, even when he was entertained by the State House choir, sleep was not coming. And he remembered. There was a time that some two guys had conspired to assassinate me. And somebody unearthed that plot. Could you check in the records and bring that occurrence to me? And who was the person who unearthed that plot? The records were examined and it was found that it was none other than the defiant Mordecai. The king asked, what has been done to this man? What reward has been given to him? And they say nothing was done. Life just continued. The king said, no, it can't be. And at that particular juncture, it happens that morning had already come. And Haman has left his home early in the morning, coming to the king to get the permission to have Mordecai executed on the gallows. And as he is entering the royal palace, the king asks, who is in the court? And he is told it is Haman. He is told, bring him in. Haman comes in. The king asks him a question. What should be done for the man that the king delights to honor? Very simple question. And Haman thought to himself, who is the other person that the king would delight to honor apart from myself? I mean, I have been second to him. I have had a lot of favors with the king. And so Haman thought that he was giving a description of how he will be given a special royal treatment. And he says, for the man that the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, so that as he is riding on the streets, people will identify. By the way, we saw this machine with the president the other day. Now, who is riding it today? Okay. And have them, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let them robe, let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man that the king delights to honor. When he concluded the last statement, the king told him, go at once. Now it was a command. Go at once, and whatever you have just said, without removing a corner, a comma, or an apostrophe, or a semicolon, do it exactly to Mordecai. The same guy that he has come to ask for permission that he be executed, and he had already built the gallows for him outside his own house. You can imagine, you cannot have any other bad day than what Haman had that day. The person you desire to execute, then you are told, clothe him with royal robes, mount him on the horse the king has ridden, and then go ahead of him announcing, this is what is done to the man that the king delights to honor. We are talking about royal kindness. Got a bit distracted here by this interesting story. But the point is that God has positioned each one of us in a position to show kindness to someone without expecting anything in return. And most importantly, we learn from Mordecai's example that our kindness is much more needed when we get to know that some individuals are hatching a conspiracy which will result in harming another person or other people. And in such moments, silence or inaction will not be considered as humility or minding your own business, but rather it will be considered as aiding in the perpetration of evil. And so you could be in an organization which is in the season of recruiting new staff, and people have sent in their applications, and both in soft and hard copies, and you hear some people in the office conspiring how to throw some of the applications in the dustbin and also press the shift and delete key for the soft copy application of some anonymous individuals. And you are there. You are called upon to show kindness to the applicants in such a situation, even if you don't know them. You must speak out and do something about it. What if it was your application? You could be in KEMSA or in the Ministry of Health or working in a government hospital, and you get to hear some individuals are conspiring to divert some medical supplies which are meant to benefit the poor and vulnerable taxpayers who cannot afford to pay for private medical cover or to buy medicine from the pharmacies. You cannot afford to keep silent at such a time. You must do what Mordecai did. You may be involved in distributing relief food to some poor families during the drought season, and you get to know of some characters, some plans by some individuals to divert, repackage, and sell relief food for their own selfish advantage. You cannot afford to keep quiet. You must speak out like Mordecai. You could be part of a committee which is responsible for distributing bursaries to needy students from poor families. And you get to hear of a scheme to include some students from wealthy families, or even to exaggerate the figures so that some of the amounts ends up in the pockets of some influential people, including the committee members, and you will also get your handsome cut. You cannot afford to keep quiet. You must speak out like Mordecai. You could be involved in a house construction project, and you get to hear that the contractor is planning to use substandard materials in order to make some good profits. And you know that if the plan continues, this house will be complete and it will be occupied by people, but eventually it will collapse and many people will lose their lives. You cannot afford to keep quiet. You must speak out like Mordecai. You could be involved in the current budget making process, and you get to hear that in some departments, the officers involved have already budgeted for millions of corruption money for themselves in the figures they have proposed or presented. And this is money which is dependent on the taxes which are painfully paid by the poor and hard-working Kenyans. And from some of it is from the ever-ballooning public debt. You cannot afford to keep quiet. You must speak out like Mordecai. You may be a quality assurance officer working with KEBS or at the port or in the private sector, and you get to know of a huge consignment worth of millions or billions of shillings, which has not met the required standards, but is about to be released into the market for public consumption by the many ignorant and poor citizens. You should show kindness to these ignorant multitudes by speaking out and taking action like Mordecai. I know you could be risking your life by speaking about it, but that risk is better and more God-honoring than keeping quiet. You may not also receive an immediate reward for speaking out or taking action, but God will never forget your kindness. Allow me to conclude with the third lesson about royal defiance from Esther chapter 3, verse 1 to 6, which I've already described. The Bible says that after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all of the other nobles, and all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged, and having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Mordecai was a man of unshakable convictions. He was a devout worshiper of Yahweh, and as such, he could not bow down to any other entity, whoever they may be and whatever the costs may be. He had already decided in advance what his non-negotiables were. And therefore, when he encountered Haman, who enjoyed the sight of everyone bowing down to him, whenever he passed, he knew that his own terms and conditions must apply. And so he stood firm and unmoved. He said, anybody else may bow down, but not Mordecai. This reminds me of the song, I Pledge Allegiance to the Lamb, which time fails me to sing this morning. But Mordecai had pledged absolute allegiance to the King of Kings. And Haman could not believe it. But also beware of the spirit of Haman. No, Haman had only been offended by Mordecai, but he thought that killing Mordecai alone is not sufficient. I must wipe out his entire community. Some people, you get offended or heartbroken by one person from a particular community, and you blacklist the entire community. That is the spirit of Haman. But the descendants of Haman have multiplied in our times. You will meet them at the roads demanding a bribe when you have committed a possible traffic offense. You need to refuse to bow down to Haman. Be ready to face the inconvenience of having to pay a cash bail and spending the whole day in court and paying the legal fee instead of conveniently parting with a 1,000 shillings bribe after committing a traffic offense. You'll also meet them in some offices when you urgently need your logbook or your license, your title deed, or some approvals for some projects that your client is pressing you on to deliver with certain timelines. And you have submitted all that is needed, but the descendants of Haman tell you, now if you are to follow the due process, we are not very sure when your documents will be ready. Possibly next year. But if you give a little facilitation fee, by tomorrow you will have the document. You must refuse to bow. And I believe we can give many other examples. But I believe God is speaking to us this morning through the life of Mordecai, that we need to mentor the next generation. We need to show kindness even to people that we don't know or we are not related to. And sometimes we are called upon to demonstrate royal defiance when we are confronted by things that contradict our values and the principles that we stand for and our identity as the children of God. But we also see the aspect of royal persuasion is where Mordecai now persuades Esther to take action to avert a crisis against the Jewish community. And eventually Mordecai rose to a position of royal authority, where he used that position when he was given the signet ring of the king, and he had the powers to now gazette, put some decrees in the National Gazette, and put some orders. And he did that for the welfare of the Jews. And finally, about the royal chronicles, Mordecai ensured that he had left a record for future generations to celebrate and to remember the kindness and the victory that God had given them in their time, so that they would continue celebrating it as an annual festival. So God is also calling us to document the things that God has done for us in our time, so that the generations that come after us, they may be able to read and be challenged and inspired to walk in the ways of God, to uphold godly convictions, and to make an impact in their generation for the glory of God. Allow me to invite our senior pastor to conclude for us.